Okay, now you remember the little interaction I had with Craig about Permian? Just a bit of history about the two words. Dolerite is named as a deceitful stone because, as somebody who spends a lot of time out in the field, I'll be honest, it's really hard to distinguish from diorite. The black specks, the white specks, the grey specks, you really do get confused. So the dolerite is regarded as looking so much like the other one, it's hard to pick, but it certainly is dolerite in Tasmania. Now, the Permian bit, remember the point that I made? You can't see Permian rocks. You can only see rocks. So you're a creationist out there, you're a Christian, you are given a world that God has given you eyes to see, ears to hear, and yes, even geologists use their mouth to taste rocks. If you want to distinguish volcanic rocks, chewing them is one of the best ways to go. Or if there's volcanic glass in a clay, to determine whether the clay at the bottom of the coal is volcanically deposited, you can actually chew the clay's normal medicine, by the way, but don't take the ones with the volcanic glass in. So you've got to be able to use all your senses to do this, but you want to see Permian rocks, go to Perm. That's where they get their name. Perm in Russia. Why did we end up with an English a word that actually comes from Russia? It's a town there, and it ended up in the English so-called geologic column. That's because the Kaiser, not the Kaiser, the Tsar, and the King of England were all related to each other. And so one sent his best expert over to the Russians and said, come and study these unusual rocks. So they went to Perm, said, yes, these are unusual enough to actually give them a separate category, and they were put in the geologic column. Warning, warning, the man who did this, Charles Lyell, etc., are out to destroy your belief in Noah's flood. So that lovely geologic column, which appears in the textbooks, Carboniferous, Permian, etc., the one that Lyell and the others had in England, actually is a drawing in a textbook. Go to Perm to see Permian rocks, but why do you call them that in Tasmania? Because of the correlation of the same sort of fossils, minus the bits they leave out, like the timber. That shows it's a flood deposit. And you see this all over. Now, I'm going to give you two bits tonight before we have our first question on recognizing rock layers and recognizing flood deposits, and then checking up on the order of the rocks with an example that will absolutely astound you and still doesn't get much of a recognition anywhere on the planet. There's my subheading. There's our main website, creationresearch.net. Hit Q&A buttons for anything you want from there. And why aren't we moving, Joe?
You need to bring your own slides up. These are just on the screen, John.
Right,
okay. Go down to PowerPoint.
Have I turned them off then?
No, they're still on. You need to go down to your PowerPoint and bring up your PowerPoint.
Okay. I thought I'd done that. Does that work? Yes, there we go. That's great. Excellent. Now, remember, Charles Lyell was out to get rid of Noah's flood, and God is out to remind you that he is not only creator, but the judge. And the classic name associated with the flood is Noah, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month. Note the precision. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. Violence, catastrophe, mixing of rocks and fossils, and because the flood is the first event which is going to make fossils. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. That's about 1600 years after Adam, and we've had many discussions on how old Noah was when the flood started. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of month. Now, how precise is that? He wasn't just 500, he wasn't just 600, you've got the months and the days. And again, it repeats, the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Probably the water that was buried originally the water covered the whole earth, and then the land underneath was raised up. So if the water came up, the land came up, the water went down. And again, I repeat, the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Let's go to Tennessee in winter. I like Tennessee in winter because it's so easy to do geology. But I didn't find this site. That young lady did. Yep, Bob Powell's daughter, when she was a teenager, led Uncle John, that's me, to find, look at these fossils, coalified land plants, definitely in the sandy limestone. Let's keep going. You see there's distinct layers of sand and there's distinct layers of black carbonized limestone, all in the one cliff face. There's Bob Powell. Oh, what's he got? Well, can you see the white spots there? They turn out to be fossil shells, but they're fossil shells mixed with beautifully preserved carbonized. Well, we've got tassel ferns, we've got all sorts of plants, and you can see the American coin there for scale. Oh, do you see the shell at the end of my finger? You see the mixed up plant bed? But this shell turns out to be a brachiopod. Now, brachiopods, there were hundreds of varieties of them in the geologic column. Around the world today, there's limited numbers of species, even though there's massive numbers of some of those species, like off the Australian coast. We've got brachiopods. You've got them in between the North and South Island of New Zealand. So we know these are brachiopods, and they're all marine creatures, land plants and seashells. That's what Craig was finding up in his rocks. But these ones here are at the top of the Tennessee, basically you could call it the coal fields there. Of course, they don't have Carboniferous in Tennessee. They've swapped over to Pennsylvanian because Pennsylvania is where they first studied these. But Americans always have to do their own things, particularly after they changed the spelling and got rid of the English grammar in half of their language. Seashell, land plant. Okay, Upper Mississippian. Why Mississippian? Because it was studied first in Mississippi. You want to see Mississippian rocks? Go to Mississippi. You want to see Permian rocks? Go to Perm. But the picture that appears in the textbooks never tells you about this mixture. That's the mixture that Craig found in his so-called Permian rocks. Of course, in England, Mississippian is classified as Carboniferous. Why Carboniferous? It's got carbon in it. The reverend gentleman who invented that name was just telling you what was there. So hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Those of you watching, those of you who want to do research, then look for what's actually there. Isn't that a beautiful view, by the way? That's in summertime, full of ticks and chiggers. Yeah, little blighters they are. But I'm actually at an old abandoned quarry, and it's in the Bangor limestone. But Bangor, I've traveled the world many times. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for free miles and airways tickets and supporters who'll actually pay our costs. Bangor is in Wales. All right. There's one of our supporters. You can see the big rubble pile. And yes, we've worn out plenty of jean, underpants and pants getting down some of these cliff faces. But look what, the rock's full of crinoids, sea creatures. Okay, now we started in Western Tennessee in these same beds. Now we're in Middle Tennessee and we've got coral. We've got land plants side by side. And I'll tell you what, we've come across a few nice rattlesnakes in this old abandoned quarry too. We've got tassel ferns, carbonized, coalified tassel ferns. Look, there's the actual plant turned to at least a 1/4 inch thick of coal. Wow. In the limestone, by the way. Limestone, not even related to swamps in most people's minds. Limestone, seashells. But this is full of seashells and full of coalified land plants. Now, let's go to Wales. That was the Bangor limestone, which is exactly named after Bangor in Wales. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is, see that bed? Oh, there's 3 or 4 beds there. You can actually see some repetition. Thick layer, thin stratified layer, thick layer, thin stratified layer. When my driver first drove me into this pile here, I said, stop. He said, why? I said, in that layer just up near the top, we'll find land plants in limestone. And the land plants will be coalified. He said, how would you know that? I said, I've seen this bed in Tennessee in several places. Now, this is what Derek Ager, and I'd again encourage you to read Derek Ager. He is fabulous simply because he left his university chair and he traveled the world to see what was really out there. There's some big beds. Okay. I saw that bed. I said, I recognize that sequence. That's over there in Tennessee. Let's go check. Here we are. Oh, look, exactly the same land plants, exactly the same seashells. Now, land plants and seashells mixed across the globe is an unbelievable quantity of debris in which sea creatures and land creatures are mixed. Even if you get rid of the sea by, it's compressing continental drift and all that sort of stuff, it's still an unbelievably impressive, humongous amount of land plants and coal. And you can easily recognize that lovely Y shape, which is a characteristic of only one group of plants. And you can recognize the seashells because brachiopods are still here. Wow. We're in Bangor, in Wales. And get close up. Can you see the colified, or see those little segments, the plant going across the top? Those little segments with the stripes going parallel to the plant edge tell you this is a horsetail rush, an equisetum. So we have land plants and seashells. No, where equisetum grow, you don't get brachiopods in the present world. Equisetum is still here. Most of the brachiopods are gone. Equisetum live on the dry land in the wetter parts, the swampy parts. I know that because you see some of my friends own land in Tennessee, and every summer when the rain comes, up through the concrete paths come these little horsetail rushes. Drive you mad. They've got silica in it, and they can get strong enough to, well, they really ruin your concrete path. They will come up anywhere, but they're land plants. And yes, they enjoy the edges of the swamps too, but they don't grow in the sea. Seashells? Yeah, look, the outlines are there. Seashells, land plants. Where have I seen this? Yes, praise the Lord. I've had enough energy, strength, and free tickets and people who'll sponsor me to go everywhere in the USA. And by the way, please, in America, if you're looking for Joe, then get in touch with me and say, we will actually support you to come over here. I've seen them from the Gulf of Mexico to Nova Scotia. Yes, when I see words like Newcastle, that's where they found coal. That's where the word carboniferous was invented. So when I spotted Newcastle right down on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, I said, I'm going there. So I actually drove in a car all the way. And I tell you what, there were the Pennsylvanian beds. Oh, sorry, the not carboniferous. Yes, the Pennsylvanian, because the Americans call them that. Okay, and I've seen them from Canada to eastern Turkey. There's a big advantage in doing a Derek Ager. There's a big advantage in using the air mile points to actually achieve this and do the research. What does the scripture say? Taste and see that the Lord is good. Don't just taste, because the whole scriptures is good, but come and see. That's what he said to Thomas. You want to know whether it's me? Then put your hands in the holes. Come and put your hand in the side. Man, I tell you what, that's an aggressive sort of experiment, but Thomas did it and went away believing. There's Bob. There's his rock. Yes, we collected this rock. This is now in our collection. No, I haven't yet brought that one back to Australia. It probably should be in Bob's collection, Glenn, if you're ever looking for it. We've got some fabulous bits of this here in Australia. But between these two places, Tennessee and Bangor, was 3,000 miles. Yep, that's the old metric system. An awful lot of kilometers of these shells that actually tell you there's been floods in the USA, floods in Bangor, and it's got to be the same flood because the fossils are the same. Now to actually make a comment on the geologic column, because Lyell is known for his aim. My aim is to get rid of Moses. Lyell invented the top 4 parts of the geologic column. He was then using a rule. The fossils tell us how old they were. The first guys who began the geologic column just were classifying the rocks. What's near Newcastle? Carboniferous. What's over there? And William Smith, the guy who gave us the maps of where the geological rocks were, actually was a 6-day Noah's flood believer. Read his whole history. Okay, John Mackay. A road cutting, fairly recent road cutting. We're in middle western Tennessee now, or middle Tennessee heading west. Okay, look at the fossil content. We're in the Mississippian Fort Payne limestone. Now, okay, can you see the corals? Can you see the horn corals? Can you see the layered limestone there? That's just a photograph sitting on the top surface of a rock as it's eroded away. Now, there's what we're looking at. Chattanooga Shale, Fort Payne, Mississippian. Chattanooga, Devonian, Fort Payne, hey, hang on, something's wrong here a little bit, because I learnt the evidence was the other way. Mississippian doesn't ever come below the Chattanooga, and there's no evidence of these messing up at all. They're unbent. Let me keep going. You see, here's eastern Tennessee. The Fort Payne, the limestone up there, is on the top. And the Chattanooga, and look, there's my helper for scale. There's his friend further up to show you that these are all nicely flat. But here, the Chattanooga is below the Mississippian. That's the order you find it in the geologic column. Can you see something? Between eastern and middle Tennessee, the order has changed, with not any evidence of rock movement at all, and leaving a puzzle that you won't read about in the textbooks, because the geologists who believe in the geologic column, they don't know what to do with it. But that's very real. You can go there and check it yourself, but you won't read about it much in the textbooks, because the textbooks are based on the belief that the fossil order gave you the order of events in time. As I said to Craig, you can't see the Permian, you can see the rocks. And when you go looking for the rocks, all of a sudden you discover what Joe discovered when that geologist took him up the east coast of Norwich, etc. The rocks don't always come in order. I remember standing with a professor of geography looking out over the snowy mountains. I'd just been up into Australia rather, highest coalfields. And we were having a good discussion. And she said to me, what rocks do you see? And I said, well, based on my experience, these are all Silurian. And she said, how would you know that? I said, well, they're made of the one stuff, they erode the same, and this is how they erode, even though I haven't been over where you're looking. And she said, well, I'll let you in a little secret. Over there on the right-hand side, the rocks are in the wrong order. I said, what do you mean? Well, over here, you've got the Silurian on top. She said, over there, you've got the Silurian underneath, just like here. So these are not exceptions. Norfolk, Tennessee, in Australia. And then she let go what I regard as a little bomb. I take it as her word because she was the professor and I was her student for the moment. She said, you've just been up into the highest brown coalfields, haven't you? Now, these are sort of anywhere up to supposedly 40 million years old. And I said, yes. She said, they found an Aboriginal canoe in the coal. Now just pray that I'll be able to continue looking for that, because it's disappeared from the records. But she knows about it. And in a couple of weeks' time or more, we'll be showing you some really unusual Aboriginal stuff that came out of the coalfields. And it should, well, perhaps it's not Aboriginal. Perhaps there were different people here just after the flood. But that's too provocative for the moment. Okay, let's just do the last little bit of here. Start in Ontario, Canada. What are you looking at? The same rock that we saw down in Tennessee. There's yours truly, looking at it. We're up near a place called the Kettles because of those funny big round stones that are there. But it's exactly the same shale. It's got exactly the same fossils of marine stuff as well as, radioactive shale. Hey, pretty neat. You'll find this stuff, it's a characteristic of this Devonian shale. When you go down to Tennessee and Kentucky, you find it all the way down. You can actually track this bed, even if you know nothing about geology. And yes, I personally have driven from Canada all the way down to here and stopped and collected specimens. Drives people who look after me mad. Oh, there's the plants. And you can use these plants because they're all, this is down on Old Highway 70 in Tennessee now, and you can use the direction of the plants to tell you which way the water was going. Plants, seashells. Look at these white seashells in the bottom there. There it is again. Eastern Tennessee to Middle Tennessee, Fort Payne's on the top, limestone, Chattanooga shales underneath. And underneath that, by the way, on the other side of the lake, there are fossil trees in the Devonian. Tut, wasn't supposed to be there, but it was and still is. But you find all of these plants beautifully buried and carbonized intact, not just squashed and messed up, but carbonized so you can recognize the individual fossil plants by name. In fact, look, there's Vance Nelson. when he was a student down there. He was just a colleague of mine for many, many years, and still is up there in Canada. But here we were on a field trip, land plants, and hey, I knew what those seashells were because that's one of the brachiopods that still lives in Australia, Lingula. That's a characteristic brachiopod up here. But land plants, sorry, the land plants shown there don't exist in Australia at all. They used to. Land plant, seashell, fabulous specimens, Lingula shells. If you put these at hundreds of millions of years old, you've definitely proved evolution hasn't happened one bit. Lingulas are still here. There's the Chattanooga Shale as you head up the side of the valley in Tennessee. And look, you can actually, oh, this is radioactive, by the way. So I always tell the students when they get a specimen of this, boys, don't keep it in your pocket. It's true that radioactivity here is not exactly the safest to keep in your pocket. Back in World War II, if you Americans want to check your records, they were thinking of mining this Devonian shale for use in nuclear products. They were desperate to get nuclear stuff. And you still probably could if you could afford to dig up enough of it. But you see, this stuff goes right across the top of Scotland, and that's why they built their nuclear reactor power stations up there. Yep, little known secrets that slip out every now and then. Look at that coalified plant. Land plants and seashells in Tennessee, Western Tennessee, land plants and seashells in Canada. In fact, just mapping what we've done in the USA. Look, I've driven all down that section there. I've been right over the Middle West. I've been further west, and you can follow it everywhere. Now, whether you end up thinking it flowed from the northwest to the southeast or from the other way, you can actually tell it's all a flood deposit. And I haven't even bothered about overseas yet. You see, when you're looking at the evidence for a flood, then remember to actually look for the rocks, not the time category. In fact, you're looking at massive flood deposits that the ordinary person doesn't even think of. Shale, slow deposit on the bottom of a swamp, full of trees and plants and seashells. Hogwash. That's not a slow deposit on the bottom of the swamp any more than you found coal on the bottom of the swamp in Louisiana swamps. It just doesn't exist that way. Good. Now, one last thing before we throw it open to questions, and then Diane will come back after that with some great look at, can you do the biologos thing and say the Genesis flood was only local or didn't exist at all, and why it matters. That's Diane coming up at the moment. Okay, now Craig mentioned Permian, and he said that I took some of those pictures of the coal with the fossil trees in. I certainly did. And in fact, in the early days, the first professor of geology actually mentioned that these trees went all the way through from one seam to another. Now, I was basically booted out of the geological conferences for saying such a thing because I gave the geologists directions as to where they could see this. Yes, I've excavated one tree from the bottom coal seam right the way through to the next, have got heaps of pictures of it. So boo-boo to Professor Plymer, who said there's no such trees. There's plenty of such trees. He just wants to be like Elian and leave not only Noah's flood out, but the God who is the judge. I warn you, Christians, you're going to preach about Jesus' love. It only makes sense in the category of God as judge of sin. The God who sent Noah's flood still hates sin. And that only makes sense in the light of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where God has the right as creator to judge his world any way he wishes. Aren't you glad that he is morally perfect and morally good? But what's the point I'm trying to make? You come with me to Newcastle and you find an interesting dilemma. I've actually driven north and south. You can follow that coal field all the way up to the edge of the Queensland border. Then you have to duck underneath. So drilling, we know it exists. Then it shows up again in Queensland and heads northwest, and most people never see it again. But it's absolutely massive, absolutely fabulous. But here's the dilemma you face. When they first came from England and they were used to carboniferous coal fields, they came to Australia and they saw mega coal, first discovered at the headlands just outside of Newcastle, Newcastle, England, Newcastle, Alabama, Newcastle, Australia. The people do this. That's where you find coal. But then they had much coal and they had a big argument coming up. is this Carboniferous? Because how did you classify something? If it looks like the rock, if it's got the same fossils, then you must call it the same thing. That's the rule. But sooner or later, they discovered, as I discovered by getting in my car, stopping at every cutting, every coal mine, in the days when it was no trouble to actually gain access. You didn't need all these safety, security checks and everything, and asking and collecting. As you head west, you discover, all those nice vertical polystrate trees, the lepidodendron trees and things like that. And then they discovered that, hey, they only start at this level. So they decided this could not be Carboniferous. They would have to put it up to Permian. And so where is it? Well, I can take you to parts of it, and you would swear on a stack of Bibles in a court of law or in a geological conference, that's Carboniferous. But then if you go a bit higher, you can actually say, no, it actually looks like the rocks from Perm. But if you come with me and Joseph on our field trips, he can tell you that we found thorns there. He can tell you that there are plenty of seashells in that stuff. So you look for what's actually there, not what label it gets in the textbook, because the textbooks are so prejudiced with two things: leave Noah's flood out. Charles Lyell, my aim is to get rid of Moses. But Moses is not just Noah's flood. Moses is about God who is judge. Moses is about God who is the creator. So please don't think we are being prejudiced. We're just telling you what our belief system is, and they are not. So if you're doing geology, force them to the issue. Yep, you'll have to gain a few skills in debating to do that, but it's really worthwhile saying, why haven't we been told about Noah's flood as part of the naming of this? It'll produce some interesting reactions, but make sure you do it after you get your degree. They don't like students showing them up at all.